Today we welcome to Politics Now presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, one of 20 candidates. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We'll start out with the fact that you are not the typical presidential candidate. Probably not everyone has heard of you, and your platform is definitely not the traditional platform. Before we get to the issues, on your website it's clear you say sometimes the issues aren't really the issues. You talk about wanting to transform American political consciousness because, quote, American politics today is disconnected from the heart, unquote. Tell us what you mean by that.
Most of what we consider the political issues today are really symptoms of a deeper issue. The deeper issue being the fact that, as we know, 1% of all Americans actually own more than the bottom 90%, and that is because for the last 40 years we have been systematically removing major portions of the U.S. Treasury into the hands of a very few people. This is an authoritarian, it has become an authoritarian corporatism, where we have corporatocracy rather than democracy. Through tax cuts, through corporate subsidies, through all manner of financial deregulation, we have turned the government more into an advocate for a very small group of people, mainly multinational corporate conglomerates, as opposed to advocacy for the American people and the planet on which we live. Now, the social contract here is supposed to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So what happens is that you have, for instance, even in the Democratic primary, the majority of candidates who are talking about how to assuage the pain produced by all this. We need to do more than lessen the pain. We need to challenge all the underlying forces that make all that pain inevitable. So there's a kind of fierce truth-telling that's not going on by the political establishment, because the political establishment is so tied in with the disease that it can't really be the healer. And so
you mentioned, and we'll get to this in your healthcare platform, about finding cures rather than treating symptoms. It seems like that's kind of part and parcel of the same thing. But given that, if what you said is true, it would be very difficult to change, right? That power, that wealth amalgamated in those hands, that's going to be a very difficult thing to change.
No, not the will of the people is actually served. First of all, and as president, what I would do is, first thing you do is you submit legislation to Congress for public funding of federal campaigns. Until we get the money out of politics, this will not change. This started in the 90s mainly with Newt Gingrich, and it's just snowballed, and now with Citizens United, et cetera. So we have legislation, we can do this legislatively to pass to make public funding for all federal campaigns. Then you roll back. We had a $2 trillion tax cut in 2017.
Because what would prevent, say,
I think it should just be public funding
from self-funding his own campaign?
It should not be. It should not be possible. It should, because otherwise, what do you get is what we've got. And you look at states like Washington. I think there's a situation where every voter would get a voucher, let's say, for $100, and then that's it. And then instead of just attending these major fundraisers after fundraisers where politicians are basically just going to a handful of people and asking for money for their campaigns, the politicians would actually be trying to get votes from the people themselves. Then we had a $2 trillion tax cut in 2017, where 83 cents of every dollar goes to the top 0.01% and those corporations. You repeal that, although I would put back in the middle class tax cut. You stop these ridiculous corporate subsidies. Why are we paying $26 billion in corporate subsidies to fossil fuel companies? There are so many ways people say, where does the money come from? Maybe the people who took it to begin with. So we need to, in that sense, truly address how far our democracy has swerved from the functioning of an actual democracy.
You sound a lot like candidates such as Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. Why are you better than them to carry this message?
I have a difficult time saying I'm better than them. I honor greatly all of the people who are running. It's all good, smart people. I just have, in some places, some disagreements. With Bernie and Elizabeth, it's not so much that I disagree, because on most things I agree. But I'm having what I feel is a more expanded conversation. Political acumen has got to start including wisdom. It has to do with addressing some of the serious ways in which this income inequality and this financial inequity is now affecting people. I'll give you an example. We have millions of American children, and you have them here in Nevada too, by the way. You have in every state, but I've certainly been exposed to some of this despair here in Nevada. We've got millions of American children who go to schools in classrooms that don't even have adequate school supplies. And if a child cannot learn to read by 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. Psychologists tell us that these children that many of them living in what's called America's domestic war zones are experiencing a kind of PTSD no less severe than that which is experienced by a returning veteran. And we should be rescuing these children no differently than if they were victims of a natural disaster. There's a public school principal here in Las Vegas who told me she has elementary school students on suicide watch. And that same public school principal said that while she had applied for a social worker at her school, even though so many of the children are getting their meals every day from the food bank, et cetera, she was told that it's actually not one of the worst cases, so they can't give her a social worker. So we need a U.S. Department of Children and Youth. We also need a U.S. Department of Peace Building. We need to wage peace, not just prepare for war. So when your national security agenda is run by short-term profits for defense contractors, rather than a true agenda to wage peace, then you get what we've got. We don't have universal health insurance because we can't cut into profits for health insurance companies and big pharma. You know, we don't adequately deal with climate change because God forbid it should cut into short-term profits for fossil fuel companies. We don't have reasonable gun safety laws because God forbid it should cut into short-term profits for gun manufacturers. We are functioning more like an aristocracy that we repudiated in 1776 than like a genuine democracy, and I feel it's time for the people to intervene.
Yeah, this is a part of what you say on your website. Humanitarian values should replace corporate values. These are the kind of things.
Well, when I was growing up, the corporation was expected to have a moral and ethical responsibility that went beyond just fiduciary responsibility to its stockholders. There was a larger array of stakeholders, shareholders, and that is the worker, the community, the environment. It's this amoral economics.
How did that change? How do you think?
Oh, it started in 1980. You know when it changed. You know as well as I do. It started in 1980, then with the Reagan years, and it really never abated. And it was very well planned, it was strategized, it was very well funded. A trickle-down economics theory that posited that only fiduciary responsibility to stockholders should organize not only our economy, then it corrupted the government, and it has hijacked our value system. It has hijacked America's value system to the point where an economic bottom line has replaced a sense that you do right by people. First, you do right by people. And this hasn't served us economically. It has destroyed America's middle class. It has created largest income inequality in almost 100 years. 40% of all Americans are struggling just to make daily ends meet. So we need a massive infusion of economic opportunity. That's why we need Medicare for all, larger, higher minimum wage, free college, cancel these college loans where we can, and unleash. This is the thing, where does money come from? I don't believe money comes from just a small group of people who are going to drop crumbs off their table. I believe money comes from unleashing the spirit of the American people. Uncap people's dreams. Our people should feel that the government is on their side, wanting you to produce, wanting you to be creative. That's how we make America great. Help people be great.
Let's talk about some of these issues. Again, you've got a pretty unconventional approach to healthcare. You're talking about focusing on healthier lifestyles, focusing on nutrition, focusing on educating people so that they can avoid some of these health problems in the first place. Again, cures for the disease, not addressing simply the symptoms.
Well, certainly we need to address the symptoms when people are ill, but in a way, our healthcare system is a sickness care system more than a healthcare system. Western medicine is very good at giving acute care once people are in an acute situation, but there is so much we do in our country that is based on policies that actually make illness more probable. That's why if we really want a healthier society, so there's not so much sickness to begin with, we have to look at our environmental policies, our chemical policies, our food policies, our agricultural policies, the toxins, the carcinogens, and also we should include in a healthcare plan much more attention to integrative approaches, nutrition, exercise, et cetera, that help forestall chronic illness to begin with.
Yeah. In terms of, you support the Medicare for All program. That has been talked about as being very costly. You mentioned that the insurance company profits would be affected severely by that if we went to a Medicare for All system. What do you think the odds are that we would actually get that, given what was likely the opposition of that healthcare industry and massive wealth and power that they bring to the table.
Well, actually, for the first time, there's going to be a congressional hearing on Medicare for All. And I don't actually have a problem with health insurance companies still having people having access to private insurance if they want it. I think that's fine. I don't see anything wrong with that at all. But remember, when you start having a medical care system, having a health care system that is going to contribute to people living a healthier lifestyle to begin with, the costs aren't going to be so high because so many people aren't going to be sick so often. The American lifestyle is not in alignment with our genes. American diet is not in alignment with nature and with our genes. And so as we start making health a greater priority and not only treatment of illness, your costs are going to go way down because not so many people are going to be so sick all the time.
On foreign policy, you mentioned wage peace and not war. What do you think about whether the United States should pull its troops back from places like Afghanistan and other places they're stationed around the globe?
Well, first of all, Afghanistan, the thing about Afghanistan that is, for me, difficult is we are now having a conversation with the Taliban. The Taliban didn't want the Afghan government to be any part of it. And the conversation is between the U.S. government and the Taliban, and the negotiation seems to be, if you guys can guarantee to us that Afghanistan will not be a hotbed for the emergence of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc., then we will pull our troops out. The problem I have with that has to do with the barbaric treatment of women by the Taliban. I have a difficult time with the fact that women aren't any part of that conversation. If I were president, I would say I want to talk to the women. I want to talk to the women of Afghanistan. I want to hear what they have to say. So when you said wage peace, not war, I'm not like a pacifist or anything like that. And I have great respect for the military, and I think we all should. I look at the military like a surgeon. If you're going to have surgery, you need to have the best, but you avoid surgery if possible. And Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense for George Bush, said we have to wage peace. General Mattis, before he left the Department of Defense, said, if you're not going to fully fund the State Department, I will need to buy more ammunition. If I'm president, there will be a far more robust relationship between state and defense. We now pay this much for things that actually are factors that wage and create peace. We pay this much for ways to wage war. We wage peace proactively, and this is not mysterious, it is statistically proven, wherever educational opportunities are greater for children, economic opportunities greater for women, violence against women reduced, and unnecessary human suffering diminished wherever possible. Those four factors, you're going to have a decrease in violence and an increase in peace. But I have to tell you something, sir. We're going back to the same thing. There are no corporate profits made from that. When you look at how much ways to prepare for war, then you're talking about profits for defense contractors. We really have to look at how deeply corrupt our government has become.
If you were president and you may have to send troops into harm's way, you may have to intervene militarily. What standard would you use to decide whether or not we ought to do that?
Well, first of all, if it is a genuine threat to our homeland or our people, that is posited. You know, the president is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, and when you take that oath, when you take that oath to the Constitution and to the safety and our people, that's first of all. And second, a threat to an ally. I mean, that's what alliances are about. An ally, where our responsibility, both legal and moral, is to be there on for the sake of an ally, and also huge humanitarian issues. You know, when Bill Clinton finished his term, he apologized for his inaction in Rwanda. Yeah. So I believe that there are humanitarian situations where the entire world order, in that sense, and moral world order is threatened, that I believe that there is a legitimate conversation about the use of U.S. force.
Yeah. Very, very rarely do you hear, you hear a lot of rhetoric, but very rarely do you hear morality applied to decisions like that.
Well, that's really why I'm running, because we need to apply our moral and ethical principles to the public realm and not just to private issues. I think we're good people. Americans are good people. I don't think we're better than other people, but I don't think we're any worse than other people. I think the American the average American asks, how can I live a good life? How do I make ethical decisions? But it's too circumscribed in our private. We need to ask, how is America good? America can't be great if America's not good. Is our economy ethical? War and peace is a moral issue. Tax policy is a moral issue. Economic injustice is a moral issue. Mass incarceration is a moral issue. Racial disparity in criminal sentencing is a moral issue. Not rescuing millions of American children who are full-on U.S. citizens, who, according to the Declaration of Independence, were given God-given inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration says that it's the function of government. Governments are instituted to secure those rights. It's a moral issue that we're not saving these children. And why aren't we saving these children? Because they're not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency. They're not old enough to work, so there's no financial leverage. So how can they possibly compete with the cloud of these multinational corporate forces whose money floods Washington, turning us into a legalized system of bribery, which is why I said, first day in office, I'm sending legislation to Congress. We need public funding of federal campaigns.
Let's talk about the gun issue.
Yes.
You have talked about universal background checks, child locks on all weapons. You've also talked about getting rid of bump stocks, which were used here in Las Vegas
Yes.
for the worst mass shooting in American history, and getting rid of military-style assault weapons. How would you do that, given the ubiquity of those weapons now? There are so many out there. How would you get those back? And institute that ban, assuming you could institute it going forward?
Obviously, it's a gnarly and complicated issue, but one way you can work on that and have some effect is through a buyback program.
Mm-hmm. And how much would you be willing to devote to something?
I don't know. I haven't processed up fully how much. We would have to see what situation we have on our hands, which is a big situation. Hundreds of thousands of guns out there.
Yeah, more than one for every American, in fact. Yeah. In terms of race relations, I know that's a big part of your platform and the things that you're running on. You've talked about apologizing for slavery, even reparations for slavery. How do you think that would go into effect? Would people accept that?
We need a moral and spiritual awakening in this country. So if people elect me, that means they get that. Where Catholics go to confession, Jews go to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. People in 12-step recovery programs know they need to take a serious moral inventory and address and acknowledge the exact nature of their character defects. All that a country is a collection of people. America has a couple of character defects we need to address. Racism is a character defect, a national character defect that has been with us from the beginning. I don't think the average American is a racist, I don't. But I do think the average American is undereducated and underinformed about the true history of race in the United States. You had 2.5 centuries of slavery, followed by 100 years that in today's language would be seen as domestic terrorism, lynchings and Ku Klux Klan and institutionalized white supremacy and segregation, at the end of which we did pass civil rights legislation to dismantle segregation. We did pass the Voting Rights Act to give black people equal access to the polls, although we've started chipping away at that, which is why we now have the voter suppression efforts all over the country. But we never addressed the economic issue of the gap, the obvious economic gap, that not only existed at the end of the Civil War, but has never been closed, in large part because any times black wealth began to be accumulated, there would be state and local efforts that would so often thwart it. So Germany has paid $89 billion since World War II in reparations to Jewish organizations, and that has gone a long way towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. And in 1988, a lot of Americans don't know this, I think, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act in 1988 that gave to all surviving prisoners from the Japanese internment camps during World War II, gave each surviving prisoner between $20,000 and $22,000. So reparations, it's first of all, by the 20th century, a very reasonable perception, and at the end of the Civil War, Tecumseh Sherman, General Sherman, promised every former slave family for 40 acres and a mule.
Sure.
So we still owe them that 40 acres and a mule. And that was a big deal for someone who, how are they going to make a living? Martin Luther King would say later, we were freed, but what were we freed to? The thing I also feel strongly about reparations, as opposed to something like race-based policies, is that reparations carry spiritual force. There is an inherent, we acknowledge a wrong has been done. That's very powerful, because that's not just economic restitution, it is a moral and a spiritual restitution. I think it would be such a gift to future generations. The Civil War was over in 1865, and we are still carrying this karmic toxicity and handing it generation to generation to generation. And it's time for our generation to do the next big thing to heal, to reconcile, and get on with this country's narrative.
Certainly there have been people who have argued that, you know, with the passage of civil rights, with the passage of equal opportunities, even with affirmative action, that we have put that behind us. But I think it's hard to make that argument now. I mean, with what we've seen in very recent days, protests and everything else, that seems to have brought that back to the fore and somewhat underscores what you're saying, that this is not something that we are over right now, and it's not something that we have ever really dealt with in a permanent way.
I think in many ways we have. I don't think we should be minimizing the sacrifices and the struggles and the successes of our ancestors, black or white. We did have the civil rights movement in this country. It's not like Civil Rights Act was nothing. It's not like the Voting Rights Act was nothing. I mean, people gave their lives, let's not forget, not to even mention the Civil War. So I'm not saying we've never done anything. I'm just saying healing, whether in a personal relationship or between peoples, sometimes takes decades and even centuries. There's a piece at a time. And in many ways, when it comes to race relations, America needs to face the fact we're sliding backwards. Mass incarceration means we're sliding backwards. Racial disparity in criminal sentencing means we're sliding backwards. We need some radical truth-telling. And you know, if you go to the doctor, then you want the doctor to heal you, but you also know that in order to heal you, the doctor's going to have to be honest with you if the test results are bad. We have a politics of pandering to popularity. So that too often politicians don't want to tell you the bad news, don't want to talk about the deep stuff we're going to all have to look at here in order to transform, because they don't want to upset anybody. It might sound negative. That's not what my campaign is, and that's not what my presidency will be either, or would be.
And that's a fairly bold move, right? Because a lot of people have gotten elected a lot of times by telling people exactly what they want to hear.
Well, I'm not part of that system. Isn't that the whole point here? Why are we looking to people whose careers have been entrenched in the system that got us into this ditch and saying, well, they're the only people we should consider qualified to get us out of this ditch? I think that is preposterous. In any system, in any business, and in any country, you're going to have to let in the new ideas, guys, if you want to get some new ways forward. And yet we have a political system that is a status quo that actually does everything it can to mitigate against that. Now, Franklin Roosevelt said that the primary role of the presidency is moral leadership. He said that the administrative aspect of the job is secondary. So I believe that political expertise, as I said before, should include wisdom. We need political vision and political wisdom now as much as we need political mechanics.
Before we leave that issue of race, Bernie Sanders recently got into a little bit of trouble. He said that he thinks felons, while incarcerated, should be able to vote. Do you agree with him or not?
No, I don't. I do believe that once people get out of prison, you've paid your debt to society, and we should be supporting people once they have paid that debt to society in living productive lives. So once they leave, but while in prison, no, I feel that that's part of your debt to society. No, not while they're in prison, I wouldn't.
Okay. Well, Marianne Williamson, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us on Politics Now. We hope you come back in the future, and good luck in the campaign.
Thank you so much. Thank you.